The Second World War turned the globe into a battlefield. Over 80 years later, the war is fast slipping out of living memory, but the remains of that terrible conflict can still be found all around us today. From mega bunkers to bullet holes, shipwrecks to cemeteries. I'm James Rogers, a war historian who is fascinated by these time capsules. They tell us the stories of death and glory, ingenuity and desperation. Now, for the History Hit YouTube channel, I'll be looking for the last traces of World War II. On the 26th of May 1940, the situation of the British Expeditionary Force in France was looking dire. Pushed back to the sea by the rampant German blitzkrieg, the majority were now trapped in a pocket on the northern French coast. The odds were stacked firmly against them. Just before 7 p.m. that evening, Churchill ordered the evacuation. The eyes of the world would be on the French port of Dunkirk.
What happened over the next few days would go down in history, an audacious attempt to get as many out as possible. Failure would have meant certain defeat for the British. It would have meant surrender.
The Germans were slow in closing the pocket around Dunkirk, thanks in part to a stiff rearguard action put up by the Allies. To minimise the risk to their own troops, the German High Command ordered the Luftwaffe to put an end to any ambitions of escape by destroying the city and port from the air. And there is still evidence of that brutal onslaught on Dunkirk's buildings today.
This is St Eloi Church, and you can see the massive chunks taken out of the stone here. Now, this occurred during the First World War, which is astonishing to think, and in fact it was rebuilt after the war. This would have been taken out by bits of shrapnel or perhaps even machine gun fire. You can even still see the bullet holes that litter all the way across the facade of the church. Now, the astonishing thing is that in the Second World War, incendiary bombs took this whole building out. It was left a burnt out shell. But still, today, you look on the front here and you can see all of the bullet holes. You combine the First World War and the Second World War damage, and the clear thing to see is you don't want to be in Dunkirk when there's a world war.
The bombing raids were devastating. It knocked out the town's water supply, meaning fires couldn't be put out and over 1,000 civilians were killed. Crucially though, for the British, the port, the best means of escape, was crippled and put out of action. Realising that evacuating the men directly from the beaches was going to be far too slow, senior naval officer Captain William Tennant, the man overseeing Operation Dynamo on the ground, looked for a solution to the problem. Today the port has been rebuilt, but there are still lingering remains of that amazing feat pulled off by the British. This is the East Mole, packed today with Dunkirk's sea fishing community rather than the escaping Allied forces of 1940. The mole is actually a huge breakwater that stretches a mile out to sea. It was built to keep the waters in the port calm and free of the chop from the channel. Crucially, this is not designed to take ships alongside. However, with the rest of the port out of action, Tennant and his men pressed the Mole into service. The East Mole has entered into the mythology of the Dunkirk evacuation, and with good reason. Over the next week, the East Mole would see over 200,000 troops embark onto ships back to Blighty. Now, the Mole might have been the major exit point for most of the men out of Dunkirk, but the beaches all along here to the east of the city were the staging posts. These beaches saw snaked queues thousands of men long, all waiting either to get onto the Mole into the port or to be taken off by smaller craft directly from the beaches. The military hardware of the British Army was simply abandoned here. This evacuation was all about the men.
If you come down to the beaches of Dunkirk today, it's hard to imagine the sheer scale of the operation that took place here. Hundreds of thousands of men packed into these beaches with all of their military equipment. But if you come down here on an especially low tide and you know where to look, it starts to reveal some of its secrets.
Because the waters all along Dunkirk's coast are a veritable shipwreck graveyard. This is the HMS Crested Eagle. She was a Thames paddle steamer built in 1925, but then pressed into service by the Admiralty at the outbreak of war. On the 29th of May 1940, she docked alongside the East Mole and took on board 600 men. As she steamed away, bound for Britain, she took a direct hit from Stuka dive bombers, causing her to catch on fire. In an attempt to save the men, the captain ordered her to run aground on the beach here. But despite his efforts, 300 were killed. Since that day, over 80 years ago, the wreck of the HMS Crested Eagle has lain here, battered by the tide and picked over for shellfish by locals. It's doubtful she will last another 80. But today, she still remains as one of the last visible traces of Operation Dynamo here at Dunkirk. She was just one of hundreds of ships of all sizes that were deployed. From huge naval transporters to the famous flotilla of little ships. And just one of over 250 that were wrecked all along the coast. Despite the enormous losses of both men and material, Operation Dynamo saw 338,000 Allied troops transported to safety. It was a victory of sorts, snatched from certain defeat and an uncertain future. The scars on the buildings, the mole, and the wrecks that litter the coast all serve as a lasting reminder of that incredible 10 days in the summer of 1940 that kept Britain in the war.